Hit it.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the book of Acts. We're backtracking. Got too ahead of myself last week and did chapter 19, straight on from 17. So now we're going back to do 18. Most of these stories they flow, but they're kind of independent stories of what Paul goes through in each town that he comes to. So you'll find that towards the end of this chapter, it touches on what we dealt with last week. So we'll deal with it when we get there. So, we're going to Acts chapter 18, Corinth. There's some interesting history about Corinth. You can see where it is there. You can see where Italy is, the heel end of the boot there. And Greece is down there. Athens, Corinth. That's where Paul's gone over to. In the book of Acts, Paul is continuing the expansion of the Yahusha movement into places more and more distant from its birthplace in Judea and Galilee. Corinth, of course, is the subject audience of Paul's letters to the Corinthians. Don't forget that everywhere Paul goes, if you recognise the place, it's because in some of these places he wrote a letter to the people, and we'll probably come into them after the book of Acts, if that's where we go. Corinthians, Thessalonians, all these books he wrote because of what he went through. So Corinth is the subject audience of Paul's letters to the Corinthians. So what goes on in Corinth here in Acts 18 provides the background context to understand both the tone and the issues that Paul addresses with the Corinthians in his letters to them. The good news is that for the first time in a while, Paul didn't leave Athens in a state of riot after he had visited there. And he wasn't being chased and hounded, nor had he been roughed up or jailed. It's pretty clear, it's pretty certain that Paul arrived in Corinth in about 50 AD, meaning it's between 15 20 years since Yahusha died on the torture stake in Jerusalem. Just to give us some perspective. Corinth was an important place. It was located on the Isthmus of Corinth and was ideally suited as a centre of commerce and shipping. It was a huge city for that day. There were 6 miles of walls surrounding the metropolis. It is estimated that the total population at that time was around 750,000 people. It was larger than Athens. Like most ancient cities, this one had been destroyed and rebuilt more than once. In one such destruction in 146 BC, it was levelled into a smouldering heap. It was rebuilt by Julius Caesar 100 years later. So by Paul's day, it had grown to this staggering size and population in only about 90 years. Pretty quick. Naturally, Corinth maintained a sizable Jewish population and boasted several synagogues. And Paul would have had no trouble in finding Jews for hospitality. Bed and brekkie. That's one of the main reasons he went to the Jews first, being one himself. He went for hospitality, somewhere to sleep. Because in this culture, you would always take in strangers and visitors. So let's jump into Acts 18. Later, Paul left Athens and went to the city of Corinth. You just heard about what Corinth is. There he met a Jewish man named Aquila, who was born in the country of Pontus. But he and his wife Priscilla had recently moved to Corinth from Italy. They left Italy because Claudius had given an order for all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to visit Aquila and Priscilla. They were tent makers, technically leather makers, but tent makers, the same as Paul. So he stayed with them and worked with them. This opens up a very interesting discussion about Paul. I mean, he was an official follower. Some might say apostle, if you want to use that word. He was officially one of Yahusha's. I mean, look how he wrote more books in the New Testament than anybody else. And yet he's out there working for a living. Interesting discussion. Let's have a look. There's a scripture that says, you don't work, you don't eat. Paul must have formed quite a bond with this couple because he mentions them in a positive way on numerous occasions. Aquila and his wife came to Corinth because the Jews had been expelled from Rome by order of Emperor Claudius. So while Rome was religiously tolerant, we dealt with that, I think it was last week, the week before, they were religiously tolerant, don't cause any trouble, you can worship whatever you like. So while Rome was religiously tolerant as a national policy, that doesn't mean that all were treated with equality. We can see immediately why Paul hit it off with Aquila and Priscilla. They were tent makers, just like he was. It is clear that Paul was supporting himself with his trade when he was in one place long enough. Apart from being a scriptural principle, i.e. if you don't work, you don't eat, this was actually a common understanding for rabbis and teachers back here, since in their Mishnah, this is what they call in the Talmud, it says, "Do not make of the Torah a spade with which to dig." Understand that? Do not make of the Torah a spade with which to dig. In other words, don't teach the Torah as a means to enrich yourself, for it should not be the main source of your income. Even the Jews and rabbis understood this back then. Look how religious and wicked they were. They still understood this principle. Rather, teachers were expected to hold jobs. This is still a good principle today, for Yahushua will raise up gifts within a group for a time to serve and minister to his people until they mature in the word and no longer need such shepherding. Since Yahushua, of course, is the shepherd. It's certainly not for a career or a profession. It's not to have fancy letters after your name. So Paul worked as a tent maker, as did Aquila and Priscilla. This is where it got interesting when we look at the actual social status of people and their jobs back here, because we see really what Paul chose to do and why. In Paul's day, stratification, that just means status. Status based on wealth, class, behaviour maybe, race. Stratification just means status, different levels of class. In Paul's day, the most common cause for social class subdivision had to do with one's occupation, as it still does today. So trade guilds were a customary means of society, dividing themselves up into social units. And it also represents the first attempt at organised labour to both police themselves and to assure that they were paid at some acceptable level. It was common that a synagogue was created and populated by members of a particular trade guild. So different trade guilds would set up different occupations. Like they did that Jewish synagogue over there would be mainly those sort of labourers, those people. I'm pointing figuratively, you don't have to look out the window. People over there, you know, that might be that synagogue's full of hairdressers. That synagogue over there is full of mechanics. That synagogue, oh, they're a bit up themselves, that one, don't go near that one. You know, they're all different synagogues based on different trades. So, different trade guilds. However, in the Roman world, check this out, in the Roman world, blue-collar labourers, blue-collar just means trades, not doctors, lawyers, those people, they're white-collar. Blue-collar are like us, workers, tradesmen. In Rome, the blue-collar labourers were looked down upon. Roman citizens did not usually indulge in manual labour, as they saw it as beneath them. So we see that Jews, and other ethnicities no doubt, were the main source of labour for the Roman Empire. Not because they were forced, but because tradecraft was seen in Jewish society as honourable. They didn't mind being tradesmen, it was honourable to them. Get a good day's work from your hand, yeah, work with your hands and everything. Great satisfaction. So it would be natural that in the diaspora, that means Jews that were scattered, born elsewhere, it would be natural that the Jews would practice their craft in a society that welcomed and needed it. That's why a lot of them went to Greece, Rome, Corinth. Not surprisingly, we find the biggest Jewish colonies within the biggest cities in the Roman Empire. So the irony of all this is that Paul was born into Jewish aristocracy. He wasn't born a tradesman. He was born into aristocracy. He was sent to the finest Jewish religious school. Gamaliel's, and then very quickly afterwards began serving not as a humble craftsman, but rather as a sophisticated and intellectual staff member of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin. The status of a tent maker was in conflict with the status of a learned operative for the Jewish high court. Remember back when we found Paul before he met Yahusha? He was a high member of the court. He was the one out there making people obey the law. If you didn't obey the Torah, he'd kill you. It is also not indicative of his privileged upbringing and social station, his trade. So how, when and why did Paul learn the trade of a lowly tent maker? Why would he adapt such a trade? Probably for two reasons. As a means of supporting himself anywhere he happened to be. Good thing about a trade. Good thing about knowing something with your hands. No one can take it off you. You can do it anywhere you are. And also to distance himself from Jewish aristocracy and the ties he had with the Sanhedrin. So to support himself and to distance himself from all those uppity people that the crones he used to deal with. Instead, he aligned himself with the common Jews, who were usually craftsmen. Essentially, not long after his deliverance, Paul chose not only to identify himself with Yahusha on a spiritual level, but also to identify himself with common folk on a social level. Because clearly, Paul was going to speak to more common folk than aristocrats. He was the main follower of Yahusha that was sent to the Gentiles. This is a great example for the bridal fellowship today. As they open the doorway of Yahusha's deliverance to others, we need to identify with those to whom we speak and serve. We need to refrain from holding ourselves as above and separate. Yet Paul was merely following the example of his master Yahusha, who was a carpenter. And so, as far as we know, he continued to be one throughout his adult life and ministry. He didn't present his message to the religious leadership or the influential, but rather to the everyday Jew, that's Yahusha. He didn't hang out with the wealthy and then at times go and make a speech to the poor people. No, his 12 disciples were the Jewish working class, not the Jewish elite. He came for the tax collectors, the whores, and the sinners. To be a fisherman, to be a tax collector, would be to be a tradesman today. To be working in some government department that everybody hates, the tax man. And to be followers of Yahusha like that today, didn't go to the high and wealthy. Even if there is a difference in education and affluence between people, there should not be an intentionally visible difference in class and status in Yahusha's body. Everybody comes out of the world with different information, different intelligence, different set of skills, different this, everybody's different. But there should not be a different class status in Yahusha's body. Paul is not only a man's man, he is also indifferent to wealth and prestige. He would make good use of his Roman citizenship and his elite education. We've seen that in some of his speeches. But it was to do Yahusha's work of spreading the good news, as opposed to spending time building bigger barns and enriching himself. He didn't use his education for himself. He used it to cunningly work the gospel message to different people who were generally arguing with him. So, he did not see it as demeaning to live among the average workers and to labour with his hands, for he wanted to be near to those he sought to teach and to utilise his craft as the means to support himself, so that he could accomplish his mission without placing that burden upon others. Paul intentionally reinvented himself so that he could follow the Master all the better. As we read about Paul, we see why early scholars claimed that heavenly angels honoured him and demons trembled at him, so that he could honestly say without bragging that, from Acts 20, these same hands served my need and those who were with me. So he's a worker. He's supporting himself wherever he goes by his own trade. And that tells us that we should be the same. We shouldn't be looking for handouts. We shouldn't be making grand schemes and plans and then asking everybody to pray for the money to fall out of the sky. No, it's stupid. People crying out for money are generally because they've done stupid things with it, or they're being unrealistic, not counting the cost, or just not listening to the thought they got. Was that thought really from Yahusha? So, every Shabbat day, Paul went to the synagogue and talked with both Jews and Greeks, trying to persuade them to believe in Yahusha. But after Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul spent all his time offering Yahusha's message to the Jews, trying to reason and convince them that Yahusha is the Messiah. But they disagreed with what Paul was teaching and started insulting him. Here we go again. So, as was common in this custom, Paul shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, "Well, if you're not delivered, it'll be your own fault. Your blood is on your own heads now. I'm clean and have done all I can. From now on, I'm only dealing with the nations, Gentiles." So he's kind of had enough of all these. This is why he distanced himself occupationally as well, isn't it? Because look at how the Jews are constantly treating the message. And it's mainly the Jews. Your blood is on your own heads now. This expression is from the Torah idea of substitution, which is the central concept of the Levitical sacrificial system, therefore of redemption in Messiah, Yahusha. That is, instead of there being a means of atonement, being bought back by blood, and an innocent animal bearing the brunt of your offence, a person's actions will now bring upon that person. A person's actions will now bring upon that person what the law prescribes for their offence. In this case, the offence is to refuse the offer of deliverance in Yahusha, and so this amounts to blasphemy. You don't want to be delivered, you have now brought the whole curses of the law, the whole consequences of the law, and essentially death on yourself. Paul's washing his hands of the whole thing. I've told you. Paul is essentially telling those who refuse to listen to him about Yahuwah's mercy through Yahusha that they are committing spiritual suicide, that he has done his part by telling them about the gospel and therefore also the consequences of rejecting it, and so bears no further responsibility in this matter. That, folks, is really the attitude we are to have. That is the attitude we are to have. We are to speak the truth of the good news to whoever the Master puts in our path. Whoever Yahusha asks us to tell, we tell. Open our mouth and say it. It's not up to us whether this person makes it into the kingdom of Yahusha. It is not our burden or responsibility. And frankly, to make it such is extremely religious. However, for us to be lazy in our duty, to tell others about Yahusha, people that we know need it and that we've been told to say it, in some ways makes us complicit in their destruction, doesn't it? If you're told to open your mouth and you don't, you're guilty too. This is the first time we read of Paul refusing to address certain of the synagogue community anymore. But he's not saying that he has just ended association with all Jews or bringing the good news to Jews. He's simply saying that his main attention is going to be to the Gentiles now. Because obviously, as we see him go on, he still speaks to Jews. But he's making his main focus now. He's been doing it for a few years now, and he hasn't had much good result from Jews, so he's heading out to the Gentile nations. So Paul left the synagogue and moved into the home of Titius Justus, a man who was a worshipper of the true Elohim Yahuwah. His house was next to the synagogue. Crispus was the leader of that synagogue. He and all the people living in his house believed in the Master Yahusha. Many other people in Corinth also listened to Paul. They too believed and were immersed. So he's getting through to a lot of people. During the night, Paul had a vision. And Yahusha said to Paul, "Don't be afraid and don't stop talking to people. I am with you and no one will be able to hurt you. Many of my people are in this city." straight from Yahusha. So Paul stayed there for 1.5 years, teaching Yahusha's good news to the people. During the time that Gallio was the governor of Achaia, Gallio was the governor of Achaia, some of the Jews came together against Paul. Hear these Jews again. They took him to court. They said to Gallio, "This man is teaching people to worship Elohim in a way that is against our law." Against our law. He's breaking the law, apparently. There weren't riots in the streets of Corinth in protest, as we saw in other places Paul went. Rather, there was a well thought out attempt by the Jewish community to officially outlaw what Paul was teaching. We see this exact thing in Israel today. Proselytizing, which means trying to convert someone. Proselytizing Jews in Israel isn't just discouraged, it is illegal. Didn't know that. And is punishable with heavy fines and jail time. The effect of what Proconsul Gallio could decide in the case and what Israel in modern times has decided has a profound effect on being able to spread the gospel in those places. It is one thing to battle individuals, it is quite another to battle against official government policy. So, interesting here. What law was Paul breaking? Yahuwah's law? Nope. Jewish law. And what the Hebrews call halakha. Jewish law. And what Jewish law is a fusion of the scriptural Torah, Jewish tradition, lots of that, and Jewish customs. The typical term that was used throughout the New Blood Covenant writings is simply the law. Paul often just says the law this, the law that, the law this, the law that. Now, we of course know that in its most technical and original sense, the term the law, or as we call it, the divine laws, points to that part of the scriptural Torah where the law of Moses are given, written down. That's the law given to Moses. But that was, in Paul's day, and still to this day, no longer what is referring to, usually. That's not what's being referred to. That's what we refer to. 10 Commandments, books of Moses, the law, the Torah. That's not what they're referring to. The law is common everyday speech among Jews. It always meant halakha, Jewish law. That's the law they're talking about. And just to make things a bit more confusing for us, the term Torah had also evolved to carry a dual meaning. At times it was used in its technical sense as meaning the first 5 books of the scripture for Moses, but in its more common use simply meant Jewish law also. To see what the Jews are doing, trying to turn the law into something, trying to turn Yahuwah's law, water it down, add stuff to it. It's now Jewish law. They call it halakha. It's not what Moses was given. This understanding is critical because Paul uses the term the law over and over again in his letters, and we need to understand what he means by that. If we don't understand that the vast majority of the time that we see the word law, that Paul means Jewish oral law, because he's often saying bad things about the law. And that's why Christians and other people go, oh, the law's done away. Oh, look what Paul said, look what Paul said. He's not talking about Moses' law, Yahuwah's law given to Moses. He's talking about the Jewish law. So we have to understand that. Otherwise, we get sent down a rabbit trail that produces erroneous doctrines. Especially that Paul is declaring that the Torah law of Moses is a bad thing, a faulty thing, which Yahuwah finally acknowledged and abolished. It's not true. Yahusha even declares in Matthew 5 that the law is not abolished, and in fact, not the smallest jot or tittle of it will change until heaven and earth passes away. He is actually the living Torah. He didn't break. Imagine being able to say that. Your whole life, I didn't break one single command. Only Yahusha could declare that. So that's what Paul's referring to when he says law a lot of the time. Jewish law. So when they say, hey, this guy's breaking the law, no, not really. Paul was ready to say something, as usual. But Gallio spoke to the Jews saying, I would listen to you if your complaint was about a crime, or other wrong. But it's only about words and names, arguments about your own law. Even he knows it's about their own silly laws. Go and resolve this problem yourselves. I don't want to be a judge of these petty matters. So Gallio made them leave the court. Then they all grabbed Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and beat him before the court. Sosthenes had allowed Paul to speak in the synagogue, and so they blamed him for the drama. They had to beat someone up. Governor, they weren't allowed to do it legally, so they just beat someone else up. This did not bother Gallio. He didn't care, he was a Roman. Back in this day, both the Jews and the Romans saw no distinction between Jews and members of Yahushua's way. They thought they were simply different sects of the same religion, Judaism. That's what the Romans and other people thought. This new Yahushua movement, they just thought they were just normal. They just thought it was another sect of the Jews. So, see how they're kind of hidden amongst religion? We're a bit like that today. You say a few things here or there, people go, oh, you're Jewish, you're Christian, you're this or you're that. They pin a religion to you. We're hidden amongst religion. But we're not religious. So what did these angry, unbelieving Jews do when Gallio refused their request? They took another synagogue leader named Sosthenes and beat him up in full view of Gallio, who expressed no interest in stopping it. And we just done, I've doubled up the paragraph. Done that one. And we've done that one. But this did not bother Gallio. Paul stayed with the believers for many days. Then he left and sailed for Syria. Priscilla and Aquila were also with him. At Cenchreae, Paul cut off his hair, finishing a Nazirite vow maybe, because he had made a promise to Yahushua. Now, this shows me, not that Paul was one of these people that was still into the Jewish traditions, it just shows me that this was a crossover time. Yahushua just died and gone 20 or so years before. This was a time, should we be taking out Nazirite vows today, growing our hair long, making vows to Yahushua like that? No, it's customary. Why is Paul doing it? Because this is a crossover time. People are still, the disciples are still reading the scriptures, trying to work out the difference between the Old and New Covenant. They're trying to and explain it. That's what all the Gospels and all the epistles are for. They're still in this state. So if you look at that and go, oh, look, Paul did it. This is after Yahushua died. We should be growing our hair and fasting and doing all these things. No. Paul's probably the most outspoken of the disciples against the Jewish customs, against the law. And we know why, because it's all customary. So you can just see that the disciples and the movement as such is adapting. It's learning how far they can go. I mean, a few chapters ago, Peter's still eating with the Jews, remember? And they're not eating with the Gentiles. He's still having racist problems because this was a big race issue going on. The gospel was not for Gentiles until now. So you can see the disciples are just going through all this violent change, customary change mainly. So that's all I have to say about the Nazirite vow. Then they went to the city of Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. While Paul was in Ephesus, he went into the synagogue and talked with the Jews. They asked him to stay longer, but he refused. He left them and said, I will come back to you again if Yahushua wants me to. And so he sailed away from Ephesus. When Paul arrived at Caesarea, he went to Jerusalem and visited the fellowship there. After that, he went to Antioch. Paul stayed in Antioch for a while. Then he left there and went through the countries of Galatia and Phrygia. He travelled from town to town in these countries, helping all the followers of Yahushua grow in their belief. So a lot of these places he'd already been to before, and now he's backtracking to see how they're all going, to encourage them. This is one of the problems that he had with the Jews. Many Gentile Elohim-fearers, because they didn't know who Yahushua was, a lot of them yet, but they knew the Torah from their Jewish mates. Many Gentile Elohim-fearers who attended some of the synagogues were more open to the gospel of Yahushua because they weren't as indoctrinated to the Jewish traditions. about the expected nature of the Messiah. I thought this was interesting. The Jews were expecting Messiah to have a certain nature. The traditional perspective was that the Messiah would be like King David was, even perhaps a reincarnation of sorts. They're all superstitious and everything, kooky. Reincarnation of sorts of King David himself. This Messiah that they were waiting for would be a warrior leader who would propel the Jews to a successful rebellion against Rome. Remember what we know about Rome? It's the fourth beast. Biggest empire of the time. And the Jews are being subjugated, persecuted as well. So they're waiting for a deliverer, not to deliver them from sin, to deliver them as a nation. They wanted a successful rebellion against Rome, to free the Jewish nation from its occupiers, Rome, install the Jewish Messiah as the new king after the line of David, which he was, of a new and expanded Israelite kingdom, and essentially replace the Roman Empire as the new next world power. Bringing Israel, this is the key, bringing Israel back into the zenith of wealth and power that they'd only heard about in the times of Solomon. That's what they wanted back. And their king, prophesied king and deliverer, was going to take them there, they thought. And what did Yahushua do with that theory?
Just throw it out the window.
Threw it out, turned it on its head. Because to do that, our king, we don't acknowledge this king because he died. Our king's going to, make us the next global power, and this king's just gone and died. He can't be the king.
Well,
no.
The thing is that what they're thinking was stupid anyway, because David was a mere shepherd to start with.
Absolutely right. So, this was an era when the synagogue, not the temple, was the source of Jewish religious instruction. And the oversight for proper observance and behaviour was performed by the synagogue leaders who took their cues from the Pharisees, and know about them. The temple was considered by many ordinary Jews to be of questionable authority, so even they don't even have respect for their own religious teachers anymore. And many considered it corrupt and illegitimate. I wonder why. So priests were simply there and tolerated because of the Torah required ritual and ceremonial functions they, and only they, could perform. So the Torah says the priests have to do this and the priests have to do that. They're all corrupt and dirty, but we've got to put up with them, I guess. See how mad this religious system is? And Paul's trying to speak to people in it. A Jew named Apollos came to Ephesus. This guy's interesting. This Apollos. A Jew named Apollos came to Ephesus. Born in the city of Alexandria, he was an educated man who knew the scriptures well. He had been taught about the Master and was always excited to talk to people about Yahushua. Interesting. What he taught was right, but the only immersion he knew about was what John the Immerser had taught. That's the only immersion he knew. Apollos began to speak very boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him speak, they took him to their home and helped him understand the way of Yahushua and his new immersion better. So see how there's guys out there doing it. After a while, not all believers looked to James and Peter as their scriptural authorities. Some believers, no doubt including Apollos, were so intelligent and educated that they didn't feel the need to have a mentor or to be given official permission to teach about Yahushua and the gospel, so they just did it. They didn't all believe the same thing. They just heard about it, incorporated their own ideas, and just did it. Now it says most of what he said was true, but he didn't even have the right immersion. So he's limited. Therefore, they didn't all believe the same things, and therefore didn't teach all the same doctrines. Sound familiar today?
Mm-hmm.
Those who get immersed in Yahushua, who do they come under? What teacher, what authority will they subject themselves to? Nobody. They all just believe what they want, take little cherry-picking bunches of teaching from the scriptures, They don't believe the same thing. They won't agree on anything. I'm talking about Yahusha's people, the bride, they think. So they didn't all believe the same thing. They didn't teach the same doctrines. They studied on their own and sought to enlighten others on their own. So it is nearly impossible to know with any certainty exactly what it is that Apollos was teaching about Yahusha. Because if he didn't have the right immersion, had he had the heart operation?
No.
Did he have Yahusha's spirit within him?
No.
So he's practically just teaching what John would have been teaching. Get ready for the Messiah. Well, guess what, mate? He's come and gone and his spirit's available to you. So that's probably what they told him. They took him back to their house and told him, there's a fresh immersion you can have. What is startling, however, is that when asked about the immersion, he said he only knew about John's immersion and knew nothing of being immersed into Yahusha. Clearly, Apollos was a motivated speaker and teacher, so after some amount of time, he travelled to Achaia, which he now sufficiently agreed with the doctrines of the way, that letters of recommendation were sent on his behalf to believers in Achaia to welcome him. So he obviously came into the fold, came into agreement, got the right immersion, because now certain followers are giving him letters of recommendation to send him out. Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, so the believers in Ephesus helped him. They wrote a letter to Yahusha's followers in Achaia and asked them to accept Apollos. So when he arrived there, he was a great help to those who had believed in Yahusha through the favour of the Father. He argued very strongly against the Jews before all the people. He clearly proved that the Jews were wrong and used the scriptures showing that Yahusha is in fact the Messiah. So, that's the message tonight, guys. You can see that Paul's whole life is a witness of how to be. He wasn't just saying one thing, doing another. He was down in the trenches working with the people. Like we are, working in society, working at a trade.
Yep.
Isn't our family, our joint families, being used as a witness?
Yep.
Yeah? Paul's whole life was a witness. He just didn't switch it on and switch it off. So, and you can see what he's coming up against. The same philosophy. Some of it sounds complicated and historical, but really what I'm trying to say is it's just as mad back then as it is today. Every second person believes something that's weird, wacko. Even heaven forbid you actually shake the hand of someone who's been immersed in Yahusha, they seem to be even more weird and wacko. So what immersion have they had, you could ask? You know, they don't know anything either. It's completely stuffed, the mindset. And you can see Satan from our Revelation studies is just going over time. And the power of him in people's hearts is just taking over everything. The end is approaching. So I don't think we should have any fear. Do you?
Nope.
That's all I have to say. Anybody like to add anything before I close?
Well, you can see what Paul was doing. He was standing firm in the word,
Yeah.
speaking out the truth.
Yeah.
That just shows us what we need to do too.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I thought that, yeah, we're going to be more like Paul, and he was going around everyone just spreading the news, and he was just confident in what he was saying and believed what he said, wasn't afraid of anything, and that's what we should all do. No.
How did he get to that place?
But
Is it because he was so rich and royal and intelligent? How did he get to that place?
he trusted in Yahusha and read the word.
He was a murderer. How did he get to the place where he wasn't afraid? What happened to him on the road?
Came to him.
How?
He cursed him until he was able to see the truth.
Couldn't see for, forget how long, a long time. And then he was down and training for years. We saw that weeks ago.
Yep.
I said, look at that verse there, that's a 3-year gap there.
Yep.
What did he go through? What? turmoil would he have gone through to go Yahusha's way?
I would have gone through hell. Anything and everything that you can think of that we've
Aren't
been
we?
through.
Going through the similar experience?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you feel when Yahusha puts an opportunity in front of you to say something, do something, be something, behave something, and you don't?
Terrible.
You felt that? So did Paul. He didn't want it. If you don't want it, you'll know it. And going back to your statement, Joe, how did he get so confident? That's all he was confident in. Yeah. And he believed it. And he knew that if anybody came against it, what would happen? That's where we have to go. So otherwise, look at the mindset that's waiting for you. If you don't go Paul's way, you're wrong. So those promptings you're getting all day, every day, ones you may or may not respond to, who is that? Only you can respond to him, because only you heard in your day what he asked you to do. Very practical, most of it. Yeah? Thank you, brothers and sisters. See you next time.